My stepmother's cheap gardenia perfume always smelled like rotting fruit. The first time she stole my future, I screamed until my throat tore. The local syndicate heard the noise, kicked in our door, and put a bullet between my eyes, while she cowered behind the sofa. Now I'm staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom. My pulse is humming. The calendar says it's 3 days before my murder. Let her take the money. This time, I'll hold the door for them. There is a specific kind of cold that accompanies a bullet to the brain. It isn't sharp. It's a sudden heavy pressure, like a thumb pressing hard into the space between your eyebrows, followed by the sound of a wet firecracker, and then a plunging, endless drop into black. I woke up gasping, my fingers clawing at my forehead. Skin, intact skin. A thin sheen of sweat, but no jagged bone. No heat. I rolled over my chest, heaving, and threw up over the side of the mattress into an empty plastic trash can. The sour sting of bile grounded me. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening. The rattling hum of the window, AC unit. The distant rhythmic thump of a neighbor's bass. And then, cutting through the thin drywall of the apartment, the sharp, rapid scritch of a butter knife scraping burnt crumbs off toast. Brenda. I sat up the springs of my narrow bed, whining in protest. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to grip my kneecaps to still them. I looked at the wall calendar tacked beside my door. August 12th, 3 days. I had tripped backward over the threshold of death, landing exactly 3 days before the end of my life. In the previous timeline, God just thinking the words made my brain ache. I had confronted Brenda on August 15th. I had come home from my shift at the diner to find the air vent in my closet unscrewed. The lockbox containing $50,000 in cash was gone. It was money my father had left behind before his liver gave out. He told me it was my ticket out of this zip code. He never told me he skimmed it from Arthur Pendleton's underground sports betting ring. I had screamed. Brenda had played dumb. And then Kevin, my 19-year-old stepbrother, had pulled up in a custom matte black Dodge Charger he'd bought in cash from Lucky's Auto. Pendleton's guys owned Lucky's. They saw the serial numbers. They followed Kevin home. When they kicked the door down, Kevin didn't fight. He didn't protect me. He fell to his knees, pointed a shaking finger at me, and screamed, "It was her money. The lease is in her name." I didn't know Brenda had shoved me toward them, using my body as a shield. I took a slow, rattling breath. The phantom thumb pressed against my forehead again. I pushed myself off the bed. The linoleum floor was sticky with summer humidity. I stripped off my sweat-soaked t-shirt, threw on a faded, oversized hoodie, and walked out into the narrow hallway. The kitchen smelled of singed bread and that nauseating gardenia perfume Brenda bathed in. She was standing at the counter, wearing a pink velour tracksuit that had been out of style for a decade. Her bleached blonde hair was pinned up in a messy clip, dark roots showing. "Sigh, morning sunshine," she drawled, not looking up from her aggressive buttering. Her long acrylic nails clicked against the plastic handle of the knife. I stared at her back. A sudden violent surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins. I could grab the cast iron skillet resting on the stove. I could smash it into the back of her head. I could end it right now. The urge was so visceral, my fingertips tingled. But no, a dead Brenda meant police. Police meant I would never leave this city. "Sigh, morning?" I forced out. My voice sounded like rusted metal. Kevin slouched into the kitchen from the living room. scratching his stomach under a stained graphic tee. He smelled of artificial blue raspberry vape juice in stale sleep. "We out of milk," he mumbled, yanking the fridge door open. "I can run to the bodega, Kevy." Brenda said, her voice instantly softening into that cloying maternal tone she reserved exclusively for him. "You need anything else? Energy drinks?" "Nah, just need a car. Can't keep taking the bus to these crypto meetups, Ma. I look like a joke." "I know, baby. We'll figure it out. Things are gonna turn around for us." I poured myself a glass of tap water, letting the lukewarm liquid coat my dry throat. "Things are gonna turn around for us." She had said that exact phrase in the first timeline. It was the justification she used in her own twisted head when she robbed me. Ilara doesn't need college. Kevin needs seed money for his empire. I looked at Kevin. He was staring blankly into the fridge mouth hanging open. He was willing to let me take a bullet so he could drive a Charger for 3 hours. "I have to get to work," I said, setting the glass down harder than I intended. It clunked sharply against the Formica counter. Brenda finally looked at me, her penciled-in eyebrows furrowing. "You work too much, Ilara. You should be helping around here more. This place is a mess. Rent's due in 2 weeks, Brenda, unless Kevin's crypto is paying out today." Kevin scowled, slamming the fridge. "It's an investment, you idiot. You wouldn't get it." I didn't argue. I just walked to the front door, pulled on my boots, and stepped out into the muggy hallway. I had 3 days. If they wanted my money so badly, I was going to hand-deliver it to them. The diner smelled like ancient fryer grease, scorched coffee, and pine cleaner. It was a smell that clung to my hair and seeped into my pores, a constant reminder of exactly where I belonged in the world's hierarchy. Gene, the owner, was hacking up a lung behind the grill, his stained apron stretched tight over a massive belly. "Table 4 needs a wipe-down, Ilara," he grunted as I tied my apron strings. On it, I spent the first 4 hours of my shift moving on autopilot, wiping sticky syrup off cracked vinyl booths, pouring burnt coffee into heavy ceramic mugs, smiling at truckers whose eyes lingered too long on my waist. The mundane rhythm of the diner was a stark contrast to the buzzing electricity in my head. I needed to construct the perfect trap. In the first timeline, the money was hidden behind the air vent in my closet. It was a good hiding spot, but Brenda only found it because she had gone tearing through my room, looking for a specific pair of earrings she wanted to pawn. She had knocked over a stack of shoeboxes, bumped the wall, and heard the hollow rattle of the loose vent cover. It was an accident. I couldn't rely on an accident this time. I had to orchestrate it. It had to be easy enough for her to find, without suspecting she was being led, but hidden enough to satisfy her pathological need to feel clever. At 2 p.m., the lunch rush cleared out. The bell above the door jingled, and Leo walked in. Leo was a regular. He was also one of Arthur Pendleton's enforcers. He was a quiet guy, maybe in his mid-40s, always wearing a neatly pressed button-down shirt that barely concealed the thick, scarred muscle of his arms. He had knuckles that looked like crushed walnuts. In the first timeline, he hadn't been one of the guys who kicked down my door, but I knew who paid for his meals. "Just black today, Ilara," he said, sliding into a corner booth. His voice was gravelly polite. I brought him the pot and poured. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He offered a tight, brief smile. "Chasing ghosts, people who owe things they can't pay. Must be exhausting. It's a living." He dropped a $5 bill on the table as a tip exactly the price of his coffee. "You look tired, kid. Get some sleep." "I will," I said, sliding the 5 into my apron. If you only knew Leo. When my shift ended, I walked the 8 blocks to the public library. I used a public terminal to search for bus schedules. I needed to be far away when the hammer fell. I booked a one-way ticket to a small town in Oregon, departing on August 15th at 6 a.m., a few hours before Kevin would predictably go to Lucky's auto. Then I went home to set the bait. The apartment was empty when I arrived. Brenda was at her part-time shift at a beauty counter, and Kevin was likely out wasting oxygen. I went to my closet, pulled a step stool, and grabbed the screwdriver I kept hidden in a winter boot. I unscrewed the vent cover. The familiar rush of stale, dusty air hit my face. I reached deep into the ductwork and pulled out the heavy, rusted metal lockbox. I sat cross-legged on the floor and popped the latch. $50,000. It was bundled in stacks of 5,000, mostly 50s and hundreds. The paper bands were old, slightly browned at the edges. I picked one up and looked closely. There it was. In the bottom corner of the band, stamped in faint blue ink, was a tiny, intricate star. Pendleton's mark. A quiet way for his counters to track their ledgers. It wasn't meant for the police. It was meant for other criminals. I hated my father in that moment. I hated him for leaving me a bomb disguised as a lifeboat. I took the stacks of cash out of the box. I needed a new container. I dug under my bed and pulled out a vintage leather suitcase I had bought at a thrift store years ago. The leather was slick and smelled faintly of mildew. I placed the money inside. Now for the trail of breadcrumbs. I grabbed a cheap-lined notebook from my desk. In the middle of the book, amidst old biology notes, I wrote in large, frantic handwriting, August 10th, counted the college fund again, $50,000. Dad's money is safe in the brown suitcase under the bed. Need to deposit it in a secure account soon, before someone finds it. I ripped the page slightly, making it look like I had handled it often. I left the notebook on my nightstand, slightly buried under a pile of laundry, but with the edge sticking out just enough to catch a snooping eye. I pushed the brown suitcase under the bed, leaving one of the brass clasps undone so it wouldn't lock properly. I scattered a few dust bunnies around it to make it look undisturbed. Then I packed my actual life. I took my birth certificate, my social security card, my high school diploma, and the $600 in legitimate cash I had saved from diner tips. I stuffed them into a plain black backpack, along with 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and a heavy winter coat. I shoved the backpack deep into the bottom of the hallway hall closet, buried beneath Brenda's mountain of winter scarves and moldy umbrellas. She never cleaned that closet. It was the safest place in the house. I sat on the edge of my bed, the springs whining beneath me. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the rats to bite. The next 48 hours felt like walking underwater. Every interaction with Brenda and Kevin was filtered through a thick layer of static. I watched them eat, watched them argue about television channels, watched Brenda paint her toenails on the coffee table. I kept waiting for the familiar spike of anger, the resentment of being their live-in maid and primary provider, but I felt nothing. You don't hate a corpse. You just wait for it to be buried. It happened on the afternoon of August 14th. I was walking home from a split shift. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, swollen with an impending thunderstorm. The air was thick, heavy smelling sharply of ozone and hot asphalt. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, a sound that vibrated in the soles of my boots. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment. I noticed it the second I put my key in the lock. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. The apartment was dead silent. The rattling hum of the AC unit had been turned off. The air inside felt trapped, suffocating. I stepped in, closing the door softly behind me. "Brenda," I called out. No answer. I walked down the narrow hallway toward my bedroom. The scent hit me first. Gardenia. Heavy, suffocating, as if a bottle of it had been shattered on the floor. I paused in the doorway. My heart didn't race. It just thumped, a dull, heavy rhythm, against my molars. The pile of laundry on my nightstand had been moved. The notebook was sitting square in the center of the table, closed. I looked down. The brown leather suitcase was sticking out from under the bed. It had been dragged, roughly scuffing the cheap linoleum. Both brass clasps were popped open. I knelt down, resting my palms on the gritty floor, and flipped the lid open. Empty. Not a single bill left behind. Not even the paper bands. They had cleaned it out completely. A cold, dark satisfaction uncoiled in my chest. Gotcha. I stood up carefully, arranging my face into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. I needed to play the victim perfectly. If I didn't react, she would know something was wrong. She might get paranoid. She might not give the money to Kevin. I stormed out of the bedroom and threw open the door to Brenda's room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, wearing a brand new emerald green silk robe. The crease lines from the packaging were still visible across the shoulders. A bottle of expensive Chardonnay, not her usual boxed garbage, was sitting on her vanity, half empty. She was buffing her nails, looking up with wide, innocent eyes that were entirely betrayed by the smug twitch at the corner of her mouth. "Ilara, what's wrong, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost," she cooed. "Where is it?" I demanded, letting my voice break. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the pain made my eyes water, naturally. "Where is my money? Brenda." She blinked, entirely unbothered. "Money? What money did you lose your tip jar again? Don't lie to me," I screamed. I stepped into her room, closing the distance between us. The brown suitcase under my bed. There was $50,000 in it. My college fund. Dad left it for me. Brenda scoffed, taking a delicate sip from her wine glass. $50,000, oh sweetheart. Your father was a drunk and a loser. He didn't leave you 50 cents. You're having one of your episodes again. The gaslighting was so reflexive, so beautifully executed, I almost had to admire it. "I know you took it," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I smell your cheap perfume in my room. Give it back, now." Her demeanor shifted instantly. The maternal act dropped, replaced by the vicious, cornered rat snarl I knew so well. She stood up, tightening the silk robe around her waist. "Watch your mouth," she snapped. "I let you live under my roof. I put food in your mouth. If you had 50 grand hidden away while I've been breaking my back at the makeup counter to pay rent, you're more ungrateful than I thought. But I didn't take your imaginary money." "Where's Kevin?" I asked, looking around. She flinched. Just a tiny tightening of the jaw, but I saw it. "Kevin is out, doing big things, making investments for our future. He's at Lucky's Auto." It was happening exactly as it did before. The timeline was holding. Kevin had taken the cash straight to the mob-owned dealership to buy that matte black Charger. He was handing over stacks of marked bills to men who would slit his throat for a $10 discrepancy. "You've killed us," I whispered, and for a fleeting second, the truth bled through my performance. The cynicism cracked, and I felt a genuine wave of sorrow. Not for them, but for the sheer, avoidable stupidity of it all. You don't even know what you've done. Get out! Brenda pointed a jagged acrylic nail at the door. If you're going to stand there and disrespect me in my own home, get out. Go cool off, and don't come back until you're ready to apologize. I'm going to the police. I lied. Turning on my heel, panic flashed in her eyes. You have no proof they'll laugh at you, Alara. I ignored her. I walked to the hall closet, dug past the moldy umbrellas, and pulled out my black backpack. I threw it over my shoulder. I didn't look back as I walked out the front door and slammed it shut, the sound echoing loudly in the stairwell. Outside, the storm had finally broken. Thick, warm sheets of rain hammered the pavement. I pulled my hood up and started walking. I didn't go to the police. I walked 5 blocks to a cheap, hourly motel with a neon sign that buzzed like an angry wasp. I paid for a room in cash, locked the deadbolt, and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. I pulled a stale sandwich I had taken from the diner out of my bag and took a bite. It tasted like cardboard. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. 4:30 p.m. If Kevin was at Lucky's Auto right now, Pendleton's guys were already making the calls. They would trace the license plate of whatever car Brenda drove to drop him off, or they would just follow him home. They would take their time. They liked to do these things at night when the neighbors were asleep and the sirens were far away. I chewed my sandwich in the dim, flickering light of the motel room. The phantom pressure on my forehead was entirely gone. I was going to live, and Kevin and Brenda were going to learn exactly what kind of investments my father had been making. The motel room was a masterclass in depression. The walls were painted a sickly, peeling mustard yellow, and the carpet felt damp through my socks, clinging to the soles of my feet like wet moss. A single naked bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting harsh, unyielding shadows across a bedspread that smelled overwhelmingly of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke. I sat cross-legged on the mattress, my back pressed against the freezing, vibrating glass of the window. The neon sign outside flickered red and blue, throwing rhythmic bruised colors across my face. It was 7:15 p.m. My stomach gave a sharp, acidic twist. I hadn't eaten anything besides that cardboard diner sandwich, but my body felt completely hollowed out, scraped clean by adrenaline. In my previous life, my previous death, the mob had come at 11:30 p.m. I knew the exact time because I had been staring at the digital clock on the stove when the front door splintered off its hinges. 4 hours. 4 hours until the bill came due for Kevin's new car. I unzipped my black backpack and dumped the contents onto the ugly bedspread. $600 in crumpled 10s and 20s. My birth certificate, the paper soft and furred at the edges. A spare pair of jeans, a toothbrush. It was a pathetic inventory of a 19-year-old life. I picked up the birth certificate. My father's name was printed in neat block letters, William Thomas. He was a man who smelled perpetually of peppermint schnapps and Old Spice, a man who swore he was going to make it big, right up until his liver shut down and his skin turned the color of old parchment. He had left me that lockbox. He had looked me in the eye, his breath rattling in his chest, and told me it was my way out. Clean money, Chloe, for school. Don't tell Brenda. He had lied. It was blood money. He had stolen from Arthur Pendleton to buy my freedom completely, ignoring the fact that men like Pendleton didn't just write off 50 grand. They sent men like Leo to carve it out of your hide. My father's final act of love was a bear trap painted gold, and Brenda and Kevin had just stepped right into it. I gathered the items and shoved them back into the bag. The four walls of the motel room were starting to press in on me. The air was stagnant heavy, with the phantom smell of gardenia perfume that I swore was still clinging to the inside of my nostrils. I couldn't sit here. If I sat here in the silence, my brain would start playing tricks on me. I would start imagining the sound of Kevin screaming, or the sickening thud of a body hitting linoleum. I needed to see it. It was a sick, twisted compulsion, but I had to know that the timeline was holding. I had to know that I hadn't just made a massive mistake and signed my own death warrant for nothing. I pulled my hood up over my head, grabbed my backpack, and walked out into the storm. The rain was coming down in heavy, relentless sheets, bouncing off the asphalt and creating a low, roaring hiss that drowned out the city traffic. My boots soaked through within the first block. The cold water seeped into my socks, numbing my toes, but I welcomed the discomfort. It gave my brain something to focus on besides the ticking clock in my head. I walked the familiar route back toward my neighborhood, keeping to the shadows of the awnings. I didn't go back to the apartment building. Instead, I crossed the 4-lane street and ducked into a 24-hour laundromat that sat directly opposite our complex. The laundromat was fiercely bright, illuminated by rows of humming fluorescent tubes that buzzed like a hive of angry hornets. It smelled of cheap powdered detergent, hot dryer lint, and wet dog. Only 2 other people were inside, an elderly man, asleep in a plastic chair, his chin resting on his chest, and a young mother mindlessly folding baby clothes while staring blankly at a muted television in the corner. I bought a bitter, lukewarm coffee from a vending machine in the back and took a seat by the front window. The glass was fogged with condensation. I wiped a small circle, clear with the sleeve of my hoodie. Through the rain, in the orange glare of the streetlights, I had a perfect view of the entrance to my apartment building. 9 p.m. The contradictory waves of emotion started hitting me in brutal, suffocating cycles. 1 minute, a cold, hard shell of vindication would wrap around my chest. They stole from you. They gaslit you. They used you as a human shield. The logic was sound. It was an ironclad defense mechanism. But then the shell would crack, and I would remember the way Kevin used to follow me around when he was 10, asking me to help him beat levels on his video games. I would remember Brenda buying me a cheap grocery store birthday cake when I turned 16, the only year she ever bothered to remember. They were parasites, yes. They were greedy, selfish, and cruel. But they were breathing, flawed human beings. And I was sitting in a laundromat, drinking terrible coffee, waiting for executioners to arrive. My hands started to shake. The styrofoam cup rattled against the plastic armrest of my chair. I could call them. The thought intruded sharp and frantic. I could walk to the payphone on the corner. I could call the apartment. Tell them to run. Tell them the money is marked. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingernails digging into the soft foam of the cup, until hot coffee spilled over the brim, scalding my knuckles. No, if I warned them, they wouldn't run. Brenda would argue. Kevin would try to hide the car. And even if they did run, Pendleton's men would track the lease back to me. They would find me at the Greyhound station. They would put the bullet exactly where it went the first time. It was them or me. The math was ugly, but it was absolute. I wiped the spilled coffee off my hand, onto my jeans, shivering in my damp clothes. I stared through the little circle in the fogged glass, and I waited for the monsters to arrive. 11:15 p.m. The rain had slowed to a miserable icy drizzle leaving the streets slick and reflective. The laundromat was empty now, save for me, in the rhythmic, hollow thumping of a single dryer, tumbling a forgotten load of towels. The harsh fluorescent lights above me felt like interrogator's lamps, exposing every nerve ending in my body. Then, headlights cut through the gloom. A matte black Dodge Charger turned the corner, its engine letting out a low, guttural growl that vibrated against the glass of the laundromat window. It pulled up directly in front of the apartment building, parking halfway up the curb in a spray of muddy water. Kevin. He killed the engine and stepped out. Even from across the street, I could see the arrogant swagger in his step. He was wearing a new jacket, leather expensive looking. He kicked the car door shut with a sneaker, lingering for a second on the sidewalk to admire the vehicle under the street lamp. He looked entirely pleased with himself. He looked like a king surveying his empire. He didn't look like a boy who had exactly 20 minutes left to live. I watched him punch the code into the front door of the building and disappear inside. The heavy glass door swung shut behind him, catching the reflection of a passing set of headlights. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't swallow. My mouth tasted like copper and old coffee. 11:32 p.m. They didn't come in screeching tires and blaring sirens. Professional violence is rarely loud. It is efficient. It is quiet. Two dark, unremarkable sedans glided down the street, their headlights turned off. They moved like sharks in black water, rolling to a silent stop behind Kevin's Charger. 4 men got out. They wore dark raincoats, the collars turned up against the drizzle. I leaned closer to the glass, my nose almost touching the cold pane. One of the men stepped into the orange pool of the street lamp. Broad shoulders, a neatly pressed button-down shirt, visible beneath the unzipped coat. Knuckles like crushed walnuts. Leo. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim metallic tool. Not a gun, a lockpick. In my nightmare, they had kicked the door down. But that was because they had followed Kevin directly from the dealership, hot with adrenaline and anger. Tonight, they had taken their time. They had traced the address, planned the route, and arrived with cold, calculating precision. Leo worked the front door lock of the apartment building for less than 10 seconds before he pushed it open. The 4 men slipped inside, merging with the shadows of the lobby. The door clicked shut, sealing them in. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I had ever experienced. I sat frozen in the hard plastic chair of the laundromat. My brain scrambled to process the geography of my own home. Right now, they were climbing the 3 flights of stairs, the rubber soles of their shoes squeaking slightly on the cheap linoleum. Now, they were in the hallway. Now, they were standing outside Unit 3B. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. I didn't want to hear it. Even from across the street, over the sound of the rain and the tumbling dryer, I was terrified I would hear the screams. My mind provided the audio track anyway. I imagined Brenda, maybe wearing her new emerald silk robe, turning around in the kitchen to see 4 strangers filling her hallway. I imagined the absolute uncomprehending shock on her face before she tried to bargain. I imagined Kevin bursting out of his room, his arrogant swagger evaporating into pure, liquefied terror as Leo grabbed him by the throat. Would they ask where the rest of the money was? Would they find the brown leather suitcase? Would Brenda try to blame it on me, realizing too late that I had already vanished? A sudden violent wave of nausea hit me. The bile rose so fast, I barely had time to react. I scrambled out of the plastic chair, my knees buckling slightly, and sprinted toward the back of the laundromat. I threw open the door to the small, grimy customer restroom and collapsed in front of the toilet, vomiting until my ribs ached and tears streamed down my face. I heaved until there was nothing left but dry, painful spasms. I slumped against the cold, filthy tile wall, gasping for air. The smell of urinal cake and stale vomit was overpowering, but it grounded me. It kept me in my body. You survived, I told myself, pressing the heels of my hands into my eye sockets. You survived. You survived. But it didn't feel like survival. It felt like I had amputated a limb to save myself from an infection. The rot was gone, but I was bleeding out on a dirty bathroom floor, permanently disfigured by the choice I had made. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a mastermind. I was just a girl who had aimed a loaded gun away from her own head and pointed it at someone else's. I sat on the bathroom floor for 10 minutes, listening to the hum of the vending machine outside the door. When my legs finally stopped shaking, I stood up, rinsed my mouth at the rusted sink, and walked back out to the front window. The two dark sedans were still there. Then the front door of the apartment building opened. Leo walked out first. In his right hand, he carried the vintage brown leather suitcase. It looked heavy. He walked to the trunk of the first sedan, popped it open, and tossed the suitcase inside. The other 3 men followed. One of them climbed into the driver's seat of Kevin's matte black Charger. There was no rush, no panic. They moved with the casual ease of men clocking out after a long shift at the factory. The engines started in unison. The cars pulled away from the curb, their taillights bleeding red into the wet asphalt, and disappeared down the street, leaving the apartment building looking exactly as it had an hour ago. Dark, silent, unchanged, except for the fact that inside 2 people had just been erased from the earth. I stood in the laundromat, my breath fogging the glass again. It was over. The trap had sprung. The bait had been taken, and the predators had gone back to their dens. I hoisted my black backpack over my shoulder. The straps felt heavier now, as if the canvas had absorbed the weight of the last 20 minutes. I didn't look at the apartment building again as I pushed through the glass door of the laundromat and stepped back out into the freezing rain. The walk to the transit center was a 3-mile blur of slick pavements and shivering paranoia. Every time a car drove past its tires, hissing on the wet road, my muscles locked up. I expected the dark sedans to circle back. I expected Leo to roll down his window and ask me if I wanted a ride. My brain, fractured by exhaustion and trauma, convinced me that I hadn't covered my tracks well enough. What if Brenda left a note? What if Kevin told them I set it up? I kept my head down, my hood pulled low over my face, navigating the city's industrial underbelly. The smell of wet garbage and diesel fumes clung to the humid air. Stray cats darted out from overflowing dumpsters, their sudden movements making my heart slam violently against my ribs. By the time the brutalist concrete structure of the Greyhound station loomed into view, it was 3:45 a.m. The station was a sanctuary of the transient and the desperate. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights illuminated rows of attached plastic chairs, most of which were occupied by people trying to sleep with their bags tied to their limbs. The air inside smelled of strong floor wax, stale pretzels, and unwashed bodies. I walked to the automated kiosk in the corner. My fingers were numb and clumsy as I typed in the confirmation number I had booked at the library. The machine whirred and spat out a thin, rectangular ticket. Departing 6 a.m., destination Bend, Oregon. I took the ticket and found an empty seat facing the large glass doors. I sat down, wrapping my arms tightly around my backpack, pulling it into my chest like a shield. The physical toll of the last 3 days was finally catching up to me. The adrenaline that had been propping me up was rapidly draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made my vision blur at the edges. My damp clothes were freezing in the heavily air-conditioned terminal. I shivered uncontrollably, my teeth clicking together. At 4:30 a.m., a man in a sharp, dark suit walked through the sliding glass doors. My breath stopped. My hands gripped the fabric of my backpack so hard, my knuckles turned white. I shrank down into the plastic chair, trying to make myself as small as possible. Leo. The name flashed in my mind. They found me. The man stopped in the center of the terminal, looking around. He reached into his jacket pocket. I braced myself, waiting for the glint of a barrel, the sharp crack of the gunshot. He pulled out a ringing cell phone. "Yeah, I just got to the station," the man said, his voice loud and exasperated. "My flight got canceled. I have to take a bus to Cleveland. It's a nightmare, Susan." He ran a hand through his thinning hair and walked past me toward the ticketing counter. I let out a ragged, shaking breath, burying my face in my wet sleeves. I was losing my mind. Every shadow was an enforcer. Every sound was a hammer clicking back. This was the price of survival. I had traded a quick death for a lifetime of looking over my shoulder. Time crawled. I watched the minute hand on the giant wall clock tick forward with agonizing slowness. Finally, at 5:45 a.m., a crackling voice came over the intercom, announcing the boarding for my bus. I stood up. My joints popped in protest, stiff from the cold and the tension. I joined the short, shuffling line of passengers, handing their tickets to the driver. The driver was an older man with kind, tired eyes. He took my ticket, scanned it, and handed it back. "Luggage goes under small bags on board," he muttered, repeating a script he had said 10,000 times. "Just this," I said, gesturing to my backpack. My voice sounded foreign to me, hoarse and incredibly small. I climbed the narrow steps onto the bus. The interior smelled sharply of blue chemical toilet disinfectant and old upholstery. I walked all the way to the back and claimed a window seat, shoving my backpack under the seat in front of me. I slumped against the window. The glass was cool against my forehead, a stark contrast to the phantom pressure of the bullet that had haunted me for 3 days. The engine roared to life, a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the floorboards. The air brakes hissed, releasing their grip on the concrete, and the bus began to back slowly out of the bay. I watched the city skyline as we pulled onto the highway on-ramp. The sun was just beginning to crack the horizon, bleeding a pale, bruised purple light over the skyscrapers. The storm had passed, leaving the city looking washed and brutally sharp in the early morning light. Somewhere, back in that maze of concrete and asphalt, an apartment door was swinging open in the breeze. Somewhere, a lockbox was empty, and a matte black car was sitting in a chop shop. I closed my eyes. The rumbling of the bus engine worked its way into my bones, a steady rhythmic thrum of forward motion. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like a mastermind who had outsmarted fate. I just felt like a ghost who had successfully managed to haunt someone else. Brenda and Kevin had stolen my future, and in return, I had stolen their lives. We were all thieves in the end. I pulled my hood further down, over my eyes, folded my arms across my chest, and let the darkness take me, praying for the first time in 3 days that I wouldn't dream at all. The Greyhound doors hissed open, spitting me out into a jarringly different world. Bend, Oregon didn't smell like wet asphalt or rotting garbage. It smelled sharply of dry pine needles, dust, and roasted coffee. The air was thin and crisp, biting at the exposed skin of my neck as I stepped off the metal stairs onto the concrete curb. My legs felt like they were packed with sand. 2 days of sleeping upright in a vibrating seat had left my spine stiff and my jaw aching from clenching my teeth in my sleep. I slung the black backpack over my shoulder. It felt lighter now, almost hollow, as if the distance had burned away the weight of the things inside it. The transit center was small, nestled against a backdrop of jagged, imposing mountains that looked like they had been ripped from a postcard. The sky was an aggressive, cloudless blue. Back east, the sky was always a suffocating gray, pressing down on the city like a dirty wool blanket. Here, the sheer vastness of it made me feel dizzy. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed 3 things: a room, a job, and to remain entirely invisible. The first 2 weeks were a master class in feral survival. I found a dilapidated boarding house on the edge of town, run by an ancient woman named Mrs. Gable, who smelled of camphor and didn't ask for a background check as long as I handed her $300 in cash. My room was the size of a walk-in closet. It had a single mattress on the floor, a radiator that clanked like a dying engine, and a window that looked out onto a gravel parking lot. It was a palace. It was mine. I spent my remaining $300 on cheap, bulky clothes, from a thrift store flannel shirts, thick denim, a heavy canvas jacket. I wanted to look like everyone else. I wanted to blend into the scenery, like a knot on a pine tree. Finding work was harder. I had no references I could safely provide, no work history that wouldn't lead a curious employer to make a phone call to my old zip code. I walked up and down the main commercial drag, popping into diners, hardware stores, and mechanics, asking for anything off the books. Finally, a bakery called The Crusted Loaf took pity on me. The owner, a barrel-chested man named Thomas, with flour permanently dusted in his gray beard, needed someone to scrape the heavy industrial mixers and mop the floors after closing. Minimum wage, paid in cash, every Friday. "You don't talk much, do you, kid?" Thomas asked on my 3rd day, watching me aggressively scrub a hardened layer of sourdough starter off a stainless steel bowl. "Not much to say," I muttered, not looking up. The harsh chemical smell of the industrial sanitizer stung my nostrils, entirely masking the warm, comforting scent of baked yeast. "Fair enough. Just make sure you get the edges. Health inspector is a real pain in the ass around here." The physical labor was a blessing. I scrubbed, lifted and mopped until my muscles burned and my hands were cracked and bleeding from the hot water. I wanted to be so exhausted by the time I walked back to my tiny room that my brain wouldn't have the energy to betray me, because the paranoia hadn't stayed behind on the East Coast. It had boarded the Greyhound with me. Every time a dark sedan drove past the bakery window, my heart would stutter in my chest, a cold spike of adrenaline flooding my veins. If the floorboards in the boarding house creaked at night, I would bolt upright in the dark, my fingers blindly searching the floor for the heavy metal flashlight I kept beside my mattress. I was waiting for Leo. I was waiting for the bill to come due. The logic of distance didn't matter to my nervous system. My body was convinced that a debt paid in blood was never truly settled. It took a month for the phantom pressure on my forehead to completely fade. The ghost of the bullet that had ended my first life finally realized it had no place in this timeline, but it was replaced by something entirely different, something insidious and quiet. Guilt, not a sharp, weeping guilt. It was a dull, heavy ache behind my ribs. I would be standing at the sink in the bakery, the hot water running over my raw knuckles, and my mind would abruptly flash to the smell of gardenia perfume. I would see Brenda's emerald green silk robe. I would see Kevin's arrogant swagger as he walked into the apartment building for the last time. I had killed them. I hadn't pulled the trigger, but I had loaded the gun, handed it to Arthur Pendleton's men, and pointed them at the targets. The cynical armor I had worn in the days leading up to their deaths was starting to rust and flake away. I was safe. The trap had worked perfectly. But I was a 19-year-old girl who had orchestrated a double homicide. I couldn't eat. The crusty loaves of bread Thomas let me take home tasted like ash. My cheekbones hollowed out, and dark bruised circles bloomed under my eyes. I looked like a ghost haunting my own life. I was free, but the cage had just moved inside my head. By November, the high desert cold had set in with a vicious, dry intensity. The gravel parking lot outside my window was permanently dusted with a layer of frost that crunched loudly beneath my boots. I had saved up $1,000. I kept it hidden in a rolled-up pair of wool socks at the bottom of my backpack. I was establishing a rhythm. I knew which floorboards to avoid stepping on in the hallway. I knew exactly how much sanitizer to use on the mixers so Thomas wouldn't complain. I knew the names of the stray cats that hung around the bakery's dumpster. But the not knowing was carving out the inside of my skull. I had actively avoided looking at the news from my hometown. I hadn't touched a computer since the library terminal, where I booked my bus ticket. Ignorance was supposed to be a shield. If I didn't know the details, they couldn't haunt me. But the human brain hates a vacuum. In the absence of facts, it manufactures horrors. On a Tuesday afternoon, my day off, I finally broke. The air was biting cold, the sky a dull, flat gray. I walked the 2 miles to the Bend Public Library. The building was warm, smelling of old paper binding glue, and the damp wool of the winter coats draped over chairs. I signed up for a guest pass and sat down at a computer terminal in the back corner, facing the wall, so no one could see my screen. My fingers hovered over the plastic keyboard. They were trembling. The fluorescent light above me buzzed a low, steady hum, identical to the sound of the laundromat sign. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I typed in the name of the local newspaper from back home. The website loaded, plastered with ads for local car dealerships and grocery store coupons. I clicked on the search bar. I didn't know what to type. Murder mob hit. I typed Kevin and the name of our apartment complex. Nothing. I typed Brenda and our street name. Nothing. I frowned, my heart thumping against my ribs. Mob violence usually made the news, even if it was relegated to the middle pages. A double homicide in a residential building should have generated at least a paragraph. I changed my search parameters. I looked up the local police blotter for the week of August 14th through the 20th. I scrolled past DUI, arrests, domestic disputes, and petty thefts. Then I saw it. It wasn't a headline. It was a tiny 3-sentence blurb tucked into a weekly roundup of missing persons. Authorities are seeking information regarding the whereabouts of Brenda, last name, and her son, Kevin, last name. The two were last seen at their residence on the evening of August 14th. Neighbors reported the apartment door left open the following morning. and the residence appeared to have been abruptly vacated. Anyone with information is asked to contact. Abruptly vacated. I sat back in the hard plastic chair. The air in the library suddenly felt too thick to breathe. They weren't dead in the apartment. Leo and his men hadn't just executed them and left the bodies for the landlord to find. They had taken them. My imagination, which had spent 3 months constructing a gruesome but contained crime scene, suddenly expanded into a terrifying, limitless void. Pendleton's guys owned warehouses. They owned scrapyards. They owned large plots of marshland outside the city limits. If they had taken Brenda and Kevin alive, they had taken them for a reason. They had questioned them. They had tortured them to find out where the rest of the money was or who else knew about the theft. Had Brenda screamed my name? Had Kevin begged blaming me, just like he did in the first timeline? It was Ilara. She set us up. She took the rest. They had undoubtedly cursed me with their final breaths, and Pendleton's men would have realized the math didn't add up. 50 grand had been stolen from the lockbox, but Kevin had only spent 30 on the matte black Charger. They had found the brown suitcase empty, save for whatever fraction of the cash Kevin had left behind. They knew someone else had been there. They knew there was a missing variable. I abruptly pushed my chair back. The metal legs shrieked against the linoleum floor, drawing a harsh shush from a librarian 2 aisles over. I didn't care. I grabbed my canvas jacket and bolted for the restroom. I locked myself in a stall and collapsed onto the toilet seat, dropping my head between my knees. My lungs seized. I couldn't pull in enough oxygen. Black spots danced at the edge of my vision. I had thought I was a mastermind. I had thought I tied a neat, perfect bow around my revenge. But I had just traded one executioner for another. If Pendleton's men were looking for the rest of the money, they might be looking for me. I was the missing stepdaughter. I was the ghost who had vanished the exact same night. I pressed my icy palms against my burning face. The smell of the public restroom, industrial bleach, and cheap pink soap was overpowering. Breathe, I told myself. Breathe, you stupid, arrogant girl. They didn't know where I was. I hadn't used a credit card. I hadn't used my real name for my rent. The bus ticket was bought with cash under a fake alias. The trail ended at the Greyhound station. I sat in that stall for an hour, riding the violent waves of panic until they finally broke and receded, leaving me hollowed out and shivering. When I finally stood up and looked in the spotted mirror above the sinks, the girl looking back at me was a stranger. Her eyes were hard flat and entirely drained of youth. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And survival, I was learning, was an incredibly ugly thing. I washed my hands, the cold water numbing my skin, and walked back out into the freezing Oregon afternoon. The ghost of Brenda's perfume was gone. It had been replaced by the metallic tang of blood and silence. 1 year later, the snow in Bend fell differently than it did back east. There was no slush, no gray muck coating the sidewalks. It fell in heavy, silent drifts, turning the pine trees into drooping white monoliths and muffling the sounds of the town until everything felt like it existed inside a snow globe. I was 20 years old, or at least the girl on my newly acquired, extremely expensive fake ID was 22. Her name was Riley. I stood at the counter of the Crusted Loaf, watching the snow fall past the large front window. The bakery was warm, filled with the rich, heavy scent of cinnamon brown butter and roasting coffee. The espresso machine hissed behind me, a comforting mechanical rhythm that had become the metronome of my new life. Thomas had moved me from the dish pit to the front counter 6 months ago. He said I was too fast a learner to waste on scrubbing bowls, though I suspected he just felt sorry for the haunted-looking girl who never talked about her family. "Hey, Riley," a voice called out. I blinked, pulling my gaze away from the snow. A local regular, a guy named Wyatt, who worked at the ski resort, was standing at the register. He had snow dusting his beanie and a dopey, easygoing smile on his face. Large, drip, black, 2 blueberry scones. I asked, my voice smooth practiced. "You read my mind, or my routine. Either way, it's impressive." Wyatt handed me a $10 bill. "You doing anything for the holidays? A bunch of us are going up to the cabin. You should come. You work too much." I took the bill, my fingers brushing his warm skin. For a split second, an old reflex flared up, a sudden deep-seated urge to flinch, to expect a trick, a trap, a sharp word. But Wyatt just looked at me with genuine, uncomplicated kindness. "Thanks, Wyatt, but I pick up the holiday shifts. Time and a half," I said, offering a small, polite smile. "Your funeral. Offer stands if you change your mind." I watched him walk out the bell above the door, jingling merrily. I didn't hate the holidays, but I didn't participate in them. Holidays required a past. They required nostalgia. I had intentionally burned all of mine down. When my shift ended at 4 p.m., the sky was already darkening into a deep, bruised purple. I wrapped my thick wool scarf around my neck and walked the mile back to my apartment. I didn't live at Mrs. Gable's boarding house anymore. I rented a small, 1-bedroom studio above a hardware store. It had decent heating, a real mattress, and a deadbolt that I had paid a locksmith to upgrade. It wasn't much, but it was a fortress. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and kicked off my snowy boots. The apartment was completely silent. I didn't own a television. I preferred the quiet. I walked into the small kitchenette, filled the electric kettle, and flipped it on. While the water heated, I went to my closet. On the top shelf, pushed all the way to the back behind a stack of spare blankets, was my old black canvas backpack. I hadn't opened it in 8 months. I pulled it down and set it on the small kitchen table. The zipper was stiff, catching slightly as I pulled it open. Inside was the detritus of a dead girl named Ilara, a few crumpled receipts from a diner, a faded high school diploma, and my father's birth certificate. I pulled the thick, slightly yellowed paper out and laid it flat on the table. William Thomas, the man who had set this entire bloody chain of events into motion. He had stolen from monsters to give his daughter a ticket, out never realizing he was just buying her a different kind of coffin. For the first 6 months, I had hated him. I had blamed him for the mob, for Brenda, for Kevin, for the agonizing guilt that kept me awake at night. I had blamed him for the fact that I had been forced to become a predator, to avoid being prey. But as I stared at his name, now listening to the kettle begin to rumble and hiss, the anger just wasn't there. It had burned itself out, leaving nothing but cold gray ash. He was flawed. He was a thief. But in his own twisted, drunken way, he had loved me enough to try, and I had survived. I hadn't just survived. I had rewritten the timeline. I had pulled the bullet out of my own head and handed it back to the universe. I had let the monsters eat each other, and I had walked away through the smoke. It didn't make me a good person. It made me a killer, by proxy. But as I looked around my quiet, warm apartment, smelling the faint trace of cinnamon clinging to my clothes, I realized I was okay with that. The moral high ground was a luxury for people who had never stared down the barrel of a mob enforcer's gun. Down in the mud, you did what you had to do. The kettle clicked off. I picked up the birth certificate. I walked over to the small metal trash can beneath the sink. I pulled a lighter from my pocket, a cheap plastic gas station lighter I used for candles. I flicked the wheel. The small flame illuminated the dark kitchen. I held the corner of the heavy paper to the flame. It caught quickly, the edges curling and blackening, as the fire ate through the official seal. The smell of burning paper filled the air, acrid and sharp. I held it until the heat licked at my fingertips, then dropped the flaming remains into the metal can. I watched the fire consume the last piece of Elara Thomas, reducing my father's name, my past, and my trauma into a small pile of brittle gray ash. I poured my tea. I walked over to the window and looked out at the snow, falling steadily over the dark, quiet streets of Bend. The timeline was mine now. The debt was settled. The ghost was finally at rest. I took a sip of the hot tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and for the first time in a year and a half, I felt absolutely nothing but peace. The fire reduced my past to ash, and with it the ghost of the girl I used to be finally vanished. Sometimes survival isn't about being the hero. It's about walking away from the blast radius and letting the monsters devour each other in the dark. I built a new life from the wreckage, and I don't regret a single choice I made to keep breathing. If this story of brutal karma and survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit the like button and share it. Subscribe to the channel for more dark, twisty revenge stories. Stay safe out there.